The wind in the Wyoming Territory does not simply blow. It screams. It howls like a wounded beast across the frozen peaks of the Wind River Range, tearing through ancient pine forests with a fury that bends century-old trees to their knees. In November of 1878, this wind carried death on its breath. It whispered promises of oblivion to anyone foolish enough to challenge its dominion. The cold was not merely temperature. It was a living thing. A predator. It sank its teeth into exposed flesh and refused to let go. It turned breath into clouds of white vapor that froze before they could dissipate. It transformed the world into a kingdom of ice and silence, where only the strongest survived and even the strongest sometimes fell. This was the land that Elijah Stone called home. He moved through the knee-deep snow with the silence of a ghost, his massive frame somehow making no more noise than a falling snowflake. Standing 6 feet and 4 inches tall with shoulders as broad as a barn door, Elijah was built like the mountains themselves. His beard, thick and dark with threads of gray, covered most of his face, hiding a jaw that had been broken in a saloon fight a decade prior. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and cold, revealing nothing of the man within. He wore a coat made from buffalo hide, heavy and stinking of tallow and years of hard use. The coat had kept him alive through 7 winters on this mountain, and it would keep him alive through 7 more if the Lord saw fit. Across his back hung a Sharp's rifle, the legendary buffalo gun capable of dropping a full-grown bison at 1,000 yards. At his hip rested a bowie knife with a blade nearly half a foot long, sharp enough to shave with deadly enough to gut a grizzly. Elijah was checking his trap line along the ridge above Dead Man's Creek, a routine he had performed countless times over the past 7 years. The traps provided him with furs to trade at the distant outpost, and the trading provided him with coffee ammunition and the few supplies he could not make or hunt for himself. It was a simple life, a lonely life. But loneliness, Elijah had learned, was preferable to the alternative. The sky above him was turning the color of a bruised plum, dark purple, and angry, signaling that a blizzard was rolling in from the north. A smart man would have been back at his cabin by now, stoking the fire and preparing to wait out the storm. Elijah was a smart man, but he was also a man who had stopped fearing death long ago. When you have already lost everything worth living for, the threat of dying loses much of its power. He paused in a small clearing, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. Something was wrong. After 7 years alone on this mountain, Elijah had developed an almost supernatural sense for when things were not as they should be. The forest spoke to him in ways that civilized men could not understand. Right now, the forest was telling him that he was not alone. The sound came again, soft, rhythmic, a whimper. It was not the chitter of a squirrel storing nuts for winter. It was not the heavy crash of a moose moving through the underbrush. It was not the howl of a wolf or the scream of a mountain lion. It was something else entirely, something human. Elijah unslung his rifle, his thumb hovering over the hammer. In the wilderness, any unexpected sound could mean danger. Bandits sometimes ventured into the high country, seeking easy prey among the trappers and prospectors. Native war parties, though rare in recent years, were not unheard of. Even a wounded traveler could be a threat if desperation had driven them to madness. He crept forward, each step deliberate and silent, his senses straining to detect any hint of ambush. He rounded a massive granite boulder that jutted from the earth like the fist of a buried giant, and what he found on the other side made his blood run colder than the mountain air. Huddled in the sheltered space behind the boulder, protected from the worst of the wind, was a pile of rags. No, not rags. A woman. She was slumped against the stone, her legs buried in a snowdrift, her skin, the blue-gray color of fine porcelain, left too long in an icehouse. She wore a thin wool coat that might have been suitable for a spring afternoon in Cheyenne, but offered no protection whatsoever against a Wyoming winter. Her hair, dark brown and matted with pine needles and ice crystals, hung in frozen tangles around her gaunt face. But it was not the woman who seized Elijah's attention. It was what she held. Curled against her chest, wrapped inside the open front of her coat in a desperate attempt to share body heat, was a small boy. He could not have been more than 5 years old. He wore a man's flat cap pulled down over his ears, several sizes too large for his small head. His entire body was shaking so violently that his teeth clicked together like dice in a cup, a rapid staccato rhythm of terror and cold. Elijah lowered his rifle. Whatever threat these two represented, it was not the kind that required bullets. He stepped into the clearing, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. The woman did not move. Her eyes remained closed, frost clinging to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, barely perceptible breaths. But the boy turned. His eyes were wide with terror, and they were the most striking shade of blue Elijah had ever seen. Bright as a summer sky, vivid as cornflowers in bloom, they seemed almost impossible in this frozen gray world. The boy looked up at the giant of a man looming over them, a man who looked more bear than human with his massive coat and wild beard, and something in those blue eyes shifted from fear to desperate hope. Elijah dropped to one knee, bringing himself closer to the boy's level. His huge presence blocked the wind, creating a small pocket of relative stillness. "Boy," his voice came out rough and cracked, rusty from days of disuse. "You alive?" The boy stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he raised one small hand. The hand was bare, gloveless, the fingers already turning the waxy white of early frostbite. He pointed at the woman beside him. And then he spoke. 6 words. 6 words that would change everything. "Mama cannot walk anymore." Something stirred in Elijah's chest. Something he had not felt in 7 long years. It was sharp and painful, like blood returning to a limb that had been numb too long. He pushed it down, buried it beneath the cold practicality that had kept him alive all these years. He reached out and pressed his bare hand against the woman's neck, searching for a pulse. Her skin was ice, colder than ice. For a terrible moment Elijah was certain she was already dead. Then he felt it, a flutter, weak and thready, barely there at all but present, a pulse that fought against the inevitable with stubborn determination. "She is alive," Elijah grunted. "Barely." He looked up at the sky. The first heavy flakes of the approaching storm were beginning to spiral down from the purple clouds. In less than an hour this mountainside would be a white hell of howling wind and blinding snow. If he left these two here to retrieve his sled, they would be frozen corpses before he returned. If he tried to carry them, he risked getting caught in the whiteout himself. There was no good choice. Only the choice that offered the slimmest chance of survival. "What is your name, son?" Elijah asked. "Henry," the boy chattered through clicking teeth. "All right, Henry. I am going to pick your mama up and carry her. You are going to hold on to me tighter than a burr on a saddle blanket. Do you understand?" Henry nodded, his small body still shaking violently. Elijah moved with a speed that belied his massive size. He scooped the woman up in his arms, positioning her over his left shoulder in the manner that soldiers call a fireman's carry. She was terrifyingly light, nothing but bone and desperation wrapped in inadequate clothing. He could feel her ribs through the thin wool of her coat. Then he reached down and grabbed Henry, tucking the boy securely under his right arm, pressing the child against his chest and wrapping the edge of his buffalo coat around him. The boy was so small he barely registered as additional weight. "Hold on," Elijah commanded. "Do not let go. No matter what happens, do not let go." And then he began to run. The journey back to his cabin was 1 mile of pure hell. The wind picked up almost immediately, as if the storm itself was determined to stop him from saving these strangers. Snow that had been falling gently began to drive sideways, stinging Elijah's exposed face like thousands of tiny needles. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing. The world became a swirling white chaos, with no up or down, no left or right, only the burning in his legs and the desperate need to keep moving. His legs screamed in protest. Each step required him to lift his foot clear of snow that came up to his thigh in places, then plunge it down again into the unknown depths beneath. The woman on his shoulder was dead weight, her body limp and unresponsive. Every few steps, she threatened to slide off, and Elijah had to adjust his grip while still running, still pushing forward. The boy stopped shivering. That was the worst sign of all. When a body stops shivering, it means the core temperature has dropped so low that the muscles no longer have the energy to generate heat. It means death is very close. "Henry," Elijah roared over the wind. "Talk to me. Tell me something." "Cold," the boy mumbled into Elijah's chest, his voice barely audible. "I know you are cold. Tell me about something else. Tell me about your mama. What does she like to do?" A long pause. Elijah feared the boy had lost consciousness. Then weakly, "She sings." "What does she sing?" "Songs, pretty songs, about birds." "What kind of birds?" "Bluebirds." Elijah did not know any songs about bluebirds, but he began to hum anyway, a tuneless melody that he pulled from somewhere deep in his memory. It did not matter what the song was. It only mattered that the boy stayed awake, stayed talking, stayed alive. 200 steps, 300. Elijah counted them in his head, using the numbers to block out the pain in his legs, the burning in his lungs, the creeping numbness in his own fingers. He navigated by memory alone, counting on 7 years of walking these paths to guide him when his eyes were useless. The ghostly shape of the Douglas firs to his left, the large rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear on his right, the slight rise in the terrain that marked the beginning of the ridge where his cabin stood. He stumbled over a buried log and fell to one knee. The woman slipped from his shoulder, sliding down until only his desperate grip on her coat prevented her from tumbling into the snow. Elijah growled a curse, gritted his teeth, and heaved himself back to his feet. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned. Every instinct told him to stop, to rest, to give up. He refused. The mountain would not win. Not today. Then he saw it, a dark rectangular shadow against the gray-white chaos of the storm. His cabin, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Elijah kicked the door open with his boot and stumbled inside, half falling across the threshold. He kicked the door shut behind him and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place, sealing out the howling demon of the blizzard. The sudden silence was almost overwhelming. After the deafening roar of the wind, the quiet crackle of embers in his hearth sounded like music. But there was no time to appreciate it. The cold had already staked its claim on these 2 lives, and Elijah had to fight to win them back. He carried them straight to the bearskin rug in front of the fireplace, where the remains of his morning fire still glowed red among the ashes. He lowered the woman as gently as his exhausted arms would allow. She slumped onto the rug like a broken doll, making no sound, showing no sign of consciousness. He set Henry down beside her. The boy immediately curled against his mother, seeking the familiar comfort of her presence, even though she could offer no warmth. "Safe," Elijah breathed, his hands shaking from exertion. "You are safe now." But as he looked at the woman's gray face, her blue-tinged lips, the frost still clinging to her hair, Elijah knew the danger was far from over. He had won the race against the storm. Now he had to win the battle against death itself. The cabin was built from rough-hewn pine logs, smelling of wood smoke, cured tobacco, and dried sage. It was a bachelor's fortress, functional and sparse, with no decorations beyond a mounted deer head on one wall and bunches of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. A single room served as bedroom, kitchen, and living space. A small wood stove in one corner provided cooking heat, while the larger stone fireplace provided warmth. A narrow cot pushed against one wall served as Elijah's bed. A sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the center of the room. It was not much, but it was everything Elijah had, and tonight it might mean the difference between life and death for 2 strangers. He moved with desperate efficiency. First, he threw 3 large logs onto the dying embers and blew on them until flames licked up, casting dancing orange shadows across the room. The heat began to radiate outward, but it was not enough, not nearly enough. He turned to the boy first. "Henry, I need you to be brave. Can you be brave for me?" The boy looked up at him with those startling blue eyes. Slowly he nodded. "I have to take off your wet clothes. And your mama's wet clothes, too. Wet clothes will kill you faster than no clothes at all. Do you understand?" Another nod. Elijah worked quickly, stripping the sodden wool layers from the child and wrapping him immediately in a thick, dry blanket from his own bed. He set Henry in a wooden chair near the fire, close enough to feel the heat, but far enough to avoid any danger of burns. "Stay there," Elijah commanded. "Do not move." Then he turned his attention to the woman. In the firelight he could see that she was younger than he had first thought. 25 perhaps, maybe a year or two older. Her face was gaunt with high cheekbones that stood out sharply beneath her skin, suggesting long weeks of poor nutrition. But even in her current state he could see that she had once been beautiful. Perhaps she still was beneath the ice and exhaustion. He hesitated for only a moment, a gentleman's hesitation before practicality took over. In the wilderness, modesty was a luxury that could not be afforded when survival was at stake. He unbuttoned her coat with clumsy, half-frozen fingers and began to peel away the layers of wet fabric. As he worked, his jaw tightened. The hem of her skirt was frozen solid, encased in a sheet of ice. She must have fallen into water at some point, perhaps a stream or river. That explained why she had succumbed so quickly to the cold. But it was not the ice that made Elijah's blood boil. It was what he saw beneath the clothes. Bruises. Her arms were covered with bruises. Not the random marks of accidental bumps and falls, but deliberate patterns. The shape of fingers around her upper arm. The spread of a fist on her shoulder. Some of the bruises were old, faded to sickly yellow-green. Others were fresh, dark purple and black. On her shin, a nasty gash had been crudely bandaged with a strip torn from what looked like a petticoat. The blood had soaked through and frozen into a dark red crust. "Who did this to you?" Elijah muttered to the unconscious woman. She could not answer. She could not hear him. He stripped her down to her shift, which was mercifully dry, and wrapped her tightly in his heaviest quilt, a massive patchwork of denim and down that he had pieced together himself over several winters. He positioned her close to the fire, propping her head up on a saddlebag, and began to heat water in a tin pot. For the next hour, the cabin was silent, except for the crackle of flames and the howl of the wind outside. Elijah sat in his rocking chair, rifle across his lap, watching over the woman and the boy. He fed the fire. He checked the woman's pulse every few minutes, counting the beats, willing them to grow stronger. He gave Henry small sips of warm water, forcing the boy to drink, even when he said he was not thirsty. The boy fell asleep eventually, exhaustion finally claiming him. Elijah carried him to the cot in the corner and tucked him in beneath a pile of furs, making sure the child was warm and secure. For a long moment he stood there looking down at the sleeping boy, at the small face peaceful in slumber, at the tuft of blonde hair sticking up from beneath the covers. The boy reminded him of someone he tried very hard not to think about. Elijah turned away and returned to his vigil by the fire. It was some time after midnight when the woman woke. She woke violently, explosively, like a swimmer breaking the surface after too long under water. One moment she was still and silent, the next she was gasping, scrambling, her eyes flying open in wild panic. She tried to stand and immediately collapsed her legs, unable to support her weight. She fell hard against the wooden floor, crying out in pain and terror. "Henry!" she screamed, her voice raw and broken. "Where is he? Do not touch him! Henry!" She looked around frantically, her eyes darting from the mounted deer head to the bundles of dried herbs to the hulking shadow of Elijah rising from his chair in the corner. In any other circumstance, the sight of him would have been terrifying. A giant of a man with a wild beard and cold eyes emerging from the darkness of a strange cabin. Her hand found a piece of firewood on the floor, and she grasped it like a weapon, holding it up between herself and the stranger. "He is sleeping," Elijah said softly, trying to keep his voice as gentle as possible. "He is safe. He is warm." Her eyes snapped to the corner of the room where a small lump lay beneath a mound of furs. She listened. The soft, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping child. The firewood clattered from her hand. She slumped forward, all the fight draining out of her. Tears welled up in her green eyes and spilled down her frozen cheeks. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, thank God." "You almost died out there," Elijah said, stepping into the light of the fire. "I found you and the boy by the rocks up on Dead Man's Creek. Another hour, and you would have been frozen solid." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the scars on his face, the lines of hard living carved into his features. She saw the size of him, the barely contained power in his massive frame. She saw the grim set of his mouth, the cold calculation in his gray eyes. In any other situation, he would have been a nightmare come to life. But right now, he was the man with the fire, the man who had saved her son. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name is Elijah Stone. This is my cabin. I have lived here alone for 7 years." She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, shivering violently as blood began to flow back into her extremities. The thawing process was agonizing. It felt like needles being driven into every inch of her skin. "I am—" She hesitated. The pause lasted just a beat too long. "Clara Smith." Elijah knew immediately that she was lying. The hesitation was too obvious, the name spoken with the careful deliberation of someone choosing a falsehood. But he did not call her out on it. Not yet. Everyone had secrets in the wilderness, and sometimes secrets were all that kept people alive. "Well, Clara Smith," Elijah said dryly, pouring a cup of hot water and bringing it to her, "you and your boy are lucky. Another hour and you would have been statues." She took the cup with trembling hands, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. "Thank you," she said. The words were inadequate, but she had nothing else to offer. "Do not thank me yet." Elijah sat back down, watching her over the rim of his own coffee mug. "The pass is snowed in, 20 feet of snow in the Narrows, probably more by morning. No horse can get through. You are stuck here. Days, maybe weeks." Fear flickered in her green eyes. Real, genuine terror that had nothing to do with the cold or the storm. "We cannot stay," she said quickly. "We have to keep moving. We have to." "You move, you die." Elijah's voice was blunt, leaving no room for argument. "You cannot walk. Your feet are nearly frostbitten. You have no gear, no food, no weapons. If you go out that door before the thaw, you will be dead before sundown. You are staying." The woman looked at the door barred against the storm. She looked at the boy sleeping in the corner. Then she looked back at Elijah. Her face was a battlefield of conflicting fears. She was weighing one kind of death against another. "He will find us," she whispered, almost to herself. Elijah leaned forward, the firelight catching the hard angles of his scarred face. "Who will find you?" The woman bit her lip. She looked down at the bruises on her arms, barely visible in the dim light. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she took a shuddering breath. "The man I killed." Elijah did not blink. He did not flinch. In the Wyoming Territory, killing a man was not always a crime. Sometimes it was justice. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was simply a Tuesday. "Did he deserve it?" Elijah asked. The woman looked up and her eyes hardened with a steel that surprised him. For just a moment the fear was gone, replaced by something fierce and unbreakable. "Yes." "Then why would his ghost be hunting you?" "Not his ghost." She wrapped her arms around herself. "His brother." "And who is his brother?" She hesitated again. She knew that speaking this name was dangerous. The name carried power. It carried fear. It had the weight of law behind it, even if that law was built on corruption and blood. "Hartwell," she said finally. "Silas Hartwell, Judge Silas Hartwell." The air in the cabin changed. The fire seemed to dim. Elijah went very, very still. His hand tightened around his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. Something dark and dangerous flickered across his face there and gone so quickly that anyone who did not know him would have missed it entirely. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Judge Jeremiah Rance controlled the law in the valley below like a puppet master controls his strings. His rulings were absolute. His justice was brutal. Men who crossed him had a way of ending up at the end of a rope or at the bottom of a ravine. Land that he wanted had a way of becoming his regardless of who held the deed. But for Elijah Stone, the name Jeremiah Rance meant something far more personal than corrupt justice or stolen land. It meant grief. It meant rage. It meant 7 years of exile and a wound that had never healed. Silas Hartwell, as he was called before he became a judge, was the man who had destroyed Elijah's life. The woman must have seen something change in his expression because she shrank back slightly, the fear returning to her eyes. "You know him," she said. It was not a question. Elijah stood abruptly and walked to the window. He could see nothing through the oiled parchment but the pale glow of snow and the dark shapes of trees bending in the wind. But he was not really looking outside. He was looking backward into memories he had tried to bury. "I know him," Elijah said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I owe him a bullet." When he turned back, the woman was staring at him with open confusion. "I do not understand," she said. Elijah returned to his chair, moving slowly, deliberately. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin walls. "7 years ago," he began, "I was a rancher. I had 300 acres of good bottomland along the Sweetwater River. Prime grazing land, clean water shelter from the winter winds. I built it from nothing, me and my wife Martha." The woman listened in silence, her green eyes fixed on his face. "Then the railroad surveyors came through. They wanted the water rights. I refused to sell." Elijah's jaw tightened. A week later, a lawyer showed up at my door with a document. He said my title was invalid. He said the land belonged to the territory and always had. He said I was nothing but a squatter on government property. "Hartwell," the woman breathed. "That was before he was a judge. Back then he was just a lawyer for the cattle syndicate, the land grabbers, the railroad men. He came with 5 hired guns and a piece of paper that he claimed was legal. He gave me 1 hour to pack my belongings and leave." Elijah paused. His hands were clenched into fists on the armrests of his chair. The leather creaked under the pressure. Martha was sick. Consumption. The kind that comes on slow but never lets go. I begged them to let us stay 1 more day, just 1 day, so I could find her proper shelter. Hartwell laughed. He said if we were not gone by sunset, they would burn the house down around us. The woman's hand went to her mouth. Her eyes glistened with tears. "We left in the rain. A cold October rain that cut straight through to the bone. Martha could barely stand. I loaded her into the wagon along with William, our son. He was 4 years old." He stopped speaking. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. "What happened to them?" the woman asked softly. "We lived in that wagon for 3 weeks, moving from place to place, looking for shelter, looking for anyone who would take us in. But word had spread. Hartwell had made it clear that anyone who helped us would face the same fate. We were pariahs." Elijah stood and walked to the fire, staring down into the flames. "Martha died in my arms on a cold night in early November. She died on the very land that had been stolen from us under the same stars that had watched us build our home." He heard the woman draw a sharp breath behind him. "William got the fever 2 days later. He called for his mother all through the night. He did not understand why she would not come to him. By morning—" Elijah's voice cracked, and he had to stop to regain his composure. "By morning he was gone too." The woman was weeping silently. Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through the soot and grime. I buried them next to each other beneath a cottonwood tree overlooking the valley. Then I went looking for Silas Hartwell. You tried to kill him. I had him in my sights. My finger was on the trigger. But he looked at me and laughed. He said if I killed him I would hang. He said my family would be forgotten, just another sad story lost to history. But if I lived, I would have to suffer. Every single day. Elijah turned back to face her. In his gray eyes she saw something she had not expected. Not just anger, not just grief. Something else. Something that looked almost like hope. "He was right," Elijah said. "I was a coward. I chose to live, and I chose to suffer. I came up here to the high country where his laws could not reach me. I built this cabin and I waited. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to take my revenge. But really, I was just hiding." He crossed the room and sat down across from her. The fire cast flickering shadows on both their faces. "I thought I was done with the world," he said. "I thought I had nothing left to protect, nothing left to fight for. His eyes moved to the corner where Henry slept, the small boy who had spoken 6 words in the snow that had changed everything. I was wrong. The woman stared at him. She was trembling again, but not from cold, from something else entirely. "You would help us?" she asked. "Knowing what Hartwell is, knowing what he will do to anyone who stands in his way." Elijah leaned forward. His voice dropped to something low and fierce, a growl that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "If Silas Hartwell comes for you, he will have to come through me first." She did not speak. She did not need to. Instead, she reached across the space between them, her hand shaking, and placed it over his massive, scarred fist. In that touch, something was forged. It was not love. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But it was something more immediate, more primal. It was an alliance. 2 broken people who had lost everything standing together against the man who had destroyed them both. The storm raged on outside. The fire crackled and popped. The boy slept on, dreaming whatever dreams 5-year-old boys dream. And in the small cabin on the mountainside, 2 strangers became something more. Her name was not Clara Smith. She told him the truth in the dark hours before dawn, when the fire had burned low and the storm had faded to a distant moan. "My real name is Grace," she said. "Grace Miller. Or it was before I married. After that I was Grace Hartwell." Elijah listened without interrupting. Victor Hartwell was the judge's younger brother, a drunkard, a gambler, a man who lost at cards more often than he won and took his frustrations out on whoever was closest. She touched the bruises on her arm unconsciously. "For 5 years that was me." "How did you end up married to him?" Grace stared into the dying embers of the fire. Her face was drawn, her eyes distant, seeing things that Elijah could not see. "My father owned a dry goods store in Cheyenne. He was a good man, but not a smart one when it came to money. He started gambling on cattle futures, trying to get rich quick. Instead, he lost everything. Every penny he had, and quite a bit, he did not have. He owed money to Hartwell. $2,000. More than the store was worth, more than our house was worth. Silas Hartwell offered my father a deal. I would marry his brother Victor, and in exchange the debt would be forgiven." Elijah felt his jaw tighten. "Your father sold you." He did not see it that way. He thought he was saving the family. He thought Victor would be a good husband, that I would live a comfortable life as the wife of a wealthy man. Grace laughed bitterly. He was wrong on both counts. And Victor did not want a wife. He wanted a punching bag that could cook and clean. Grace's voice was flat, emotionless, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "For 5 years I took it. I took the beatings, the insults, the humiliations. I took it because of Henry. Henry is not Victor's son. No, Henry's father was my first husband, Daniel Miller. He was a blacksmith, a good man. He died of fever when I was pregnant. I had to go back to live with my father, and that is how I ended up in this mess." She looked toward the corner where Henry slept. Victor tolerated Henry as long as the boy stayed quiet and out of sight. But 2 nights ago— Her voice faltered. She had to take a breath before continuing. 2 nights ago, Victor came home drunker than usual. He had lost big at the poker table. He started on me like always, but then he noticed Henry. Grace's hands clenched into fists. Henry was playing with a wooden horse. Victor kicked it into the fire. When Henry cried, Victor picked him up by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Elijah felt something cold and dangerous unfurl in his chest. He said he was going to toughen the boy up. He said he was going to take him out to the barn and beat the weakness out of him with a horsewhip. I looked into his eyes, Mr. Stone, and I saw the truth. He was not going to stop. He was going to kill my son. So you stopped him. There was a heavy iron poker by the fireplace. Grace's voice was barely a whisper now. I did not think. I just swung. I hit him, and I hit him again, and again. I did not stop until he was not moving any more. She looked down at her hands, still seeing blood that was no longer there. Then I grabbed Henry and my coat and I ran. I did not know where I was going. I just knew I had to get somewhere high, somewhere the horses could not follow. I did not know the storm was coming. I did not know anything except that I had to save my son." Silence fell between them. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in deep shadows. "You did not do wrong," Elijah said finally. His voice was absolute, brooking no argument. "A wolf comes for the lamb. The ewe has to use her teeth. That is nature. That is God's law. It does not matter what Judge Hartwell's law books say." Grace looked up at him. Tears were streaming down her face, but her eyes held something besides sorrow. Relief, gratitude, understanding. "Silas will come," she said. "He does not care about Victor. He hated Victor. But he cares about the Hartwell name. A woman killing a Hartwell is something he cannot let stand. He will hunt me down and hang me in the town square to make an example. He has to find you first." Elijah's voice was a low rumble. "The pass is blocked with 20 feet of snow. No horse can get through. Not for a week, maybe longer. You are safe here for now. And when the snow melts—" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the wall where his weapons hung. Beside the Sharps rifle there was a heavy Colt Navy revolver and the massive Bowie knife. He took down the revolver and checked its load, the cylinder clicking as he spun it. "When the snow melts," he said, turning back to face her, "we make sure they regret ever coming to this mountain." Grace stared at him. This stranger, this mountain man who had pulled her from the jaws of death and asked nothing in return. This scarred giant with grief in his eyes and steel in his spine. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk your life for us? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Elijah was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had yet heard it. 7 years ago I had a family. A wife who loved me. A son who looked at me like I was the greatest man in the world. I lost them because I was not strong enough to protect them. I ran instead of fighting, and it cost me everything." He looked at Henry, still sleeping peacefully in the corner. "I cannot bring them back. Nothing can bring them back. But when I found you and your boy in that snow, half frozen and dying, I saw a second chance, a chance to do what I should have done before." He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw something that had been missing for 5 terrible years. She saw the possibility of safety, of protection, of a man who would stand between her and the darkness. "I will not run again," Elijah said. "Not this time, not ever again." Grace reached out and took his hand, his massive, scarred, calloused hand that could snap a man's neck but held hers with such gentleness. "Then we stand together," she said, "whatever comes." Outside, the storm finally began to quiet. The howling wind faded to a whisper, then to silence. The snow continued to fall, but gently now, covering the mountain in a blanket of white that hid all traces of the path Grace and Henry had taken. But somewhere below in the valley where power resided, Judge Silas Hartwell was learning that his brother was dead, and the woman who had killed him was still alive, and the hunt was about to begin. The storm did not lift for 3 days. For 72 hours, the cabin became a vessel adrift in a sea of white. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling void, the constant assault of wind against timber, and the creaking protest of walls straining to hold back the fury of nature. Snow piled higher against the windows until the pale light filtering through became dim and gray, as if the sun itself had abandoned them. Inside time moved differently. It was not measured by clocks or the position of the sun. It was measured by logs burned and meals eaten, by the rhythm of breathing, by the slow, uncertain process of 3 strangers learning to exist in the same small space. Elijah was not accustomed to company. 7 years of solitude had made him feral in ways he had not fully realized until now. Every sound made him tense. The soft pad of Grace's footsteps across the wooden floor, the rustle of Henry shifting beneath his blankets. Even the sound of another person breathing while he tried to sleep felt intrusive, almost unbearable. He caught himself reaching for his rifle when Henry knocked over a tin cup. He found himself standing with his back to the wall, unconsciously positioning himself where he could see both the door and the window at all times. These were the instincts of a man who had lived too long with only danger for company. But as the hours passed, something began to shift. The tension in his shoulders eased by small degrees. The constant state of alertness faded into something more manageable. He began to remember what it felt like to share a meal with another person, to hear laughter that was not his own, to exist in the presence of others without the expectation of violence. Grace did her best to make herself useful. She could not venture outside, and her frostbitten feet still pained her when she walked, but she could cook. For years, cooking had been one of the few tasks that Victor had allowed her to perform without criticism, probably because he enjoyed the results too much to risk driving her away from the stove. Elijah's meals before her arrival had been simple to the point of brutality. Meat roasted over flame until it was charred, coffee black enough to strip paint, no seasoning beyond salt and precious little of that. Survival, not pleasure, had been his only concern. On the second day, Grace discovered the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Rosemary, bay leaves, wild thyme, sage. They had been there for years, collected in some half-forgotten moment of domesticity and never used. She took them down and began to experiment. That evening she served Elijah a plate of venison stew. The meat had been simmered slowly with root vegetables from his small store and seasoned with the herbs she had found. Steam rose from the bowl, carrying an aroma that Elijah had not smelled in 7 years. He stared at it like a man confronting a miracle. "It has a strange smell," he said. "That is rosemary," Grace replied, trying to hide her smile. "It is an herb." Elijah took a tentative bite. His expression did not change. He took another bite, then another. He cleaned the entire bowl without another word. When he set the empty dish down, Grace was watching him with barely concealed amusement. "Was it acceptable?" she asked. "It was tolerable," Elijah grunted. That night Grace noticed that the pile of firewood beside the stove had been restocked while she slept, and that someone had placed an extra blanket over Henry without being asked. She said nothing, but she smiled. It was Henry who truly began to crack the shell around Elijah's heart. The boy had been through terrible trauma. He had watched violence in his home. He had fled through a frozen wilderness. He had nearly died in his mother's arms. For the first 2 days in the cabin he barely spoke. He clung to Grace like a shadow, his blue eyes following Elijah's every movement with a mixture of fear and fascination. But children are resilient in ways that adults often forget. They bend where adults would break. They adapt and survive and find ways to heal that their elders can only envy. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, while Grace slept on the bearskin rug to recover her strength, Henry sat alone on the floor. He had no toys, no books, nothing to occupy his hands or his mind. He simply sat staring at the fire with an empty expression that no 5-year-old should wear. Elijah watched him from his rocking chair. He remembered another boy who used to sit just like that, watching flames dance and dreaming whatever dreams young boys dream. The memory was painful, but for the first time in years he did not push it away. Instead, he did something he had not done since William died. He lowered himself to the floor, his massive frame settling onto the wooden boards with a grunt. He pulled a piece of soft pine from the stack of kindling beside the fireplace. From his belt he drew a small whittling knife. He did not speak. He did not look at Henry. He simply began to carve. The knife moved with practiced ease, peeling long curls of wood away from the block. Slowly a shape began to emerge, a head, ears, 4 legs. Henry watched from the corner of his eye. His curiosity was stronger than his fear. After several minutes the boy edged closer. Elijah pretended not to notice. "What are you making?" Henry finally whispered. Elijah did not look up. "I am not sure yet. The wood tells you what it wants to be. You just have to listen." Henry frowned, confused. Wood does not talk. Everything talks, boy. Wind talks, snow talks, fire talks. Wood talks too. Right now this piece is telling me it is too ornery to be a spoon. It wants to be something with teeth. As he spoke, Elijah carved a curve into the emerging shape. A snout appeared, then ears. A bear was taking form beneath his hands. "Can I try?" Henry asked. Grace had woken at some point without either of them noticing. She lay still on the bearskin rug, watching through half-closed eyes. Her heart seized when she saw the knife in Elijah's hand so close to her son. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to pull Henry away, to protect him. But she forced herself to remain still, to watch, to trust. Elijah reversed the knife in his hand and offered the handle to the boy. But he did not let go. Instead, he wrapped his own massive hand around Henry's small fist, keeping firm control of the blade while allowing the child to feel its weight. "You have to respect the blade," Elijah said, his voice soft but serious. "It will bite you if you do not respect it. Always push away from your body, never toward. Like this." Together, the giant hand and the tiny hand drew the knife across the wood. A thin curl peeled away and fell to the floor. Henry giggled. It was a rusty, unused sound, as if the boy had forgotten how to make it. But it filled the cabin with more warmth than the fire ever could. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away and continued to watch in silence. For the next hour, man and boy sat side by side on the floor, carving together. Elijah's instructions were patient and clear. Henry's questions were endless. Why does the wood curl like that? Why is this part harder than that part? Can we make a whole family of bears? When the small wooden bear was finished, crude but recognizable, Henry held it up with triumph in his eyes. "I made it," he declared. "You helped," Elijah corrected. But there was something in his voice that had not been there before. A warmth, a softness. The ghost of who he used to be before grief had hollowed him out. That evening, after Henry had fallen asleep with the wooden bear clutched in his hand, Grace sat across from Elijah at the table. A single kerosene lamp burned between them, casting long shadows on the log walls. "You have been around children before," she said. It was not a question. Elijah was silent for a long moment. His hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee, but he was not drinking it. He was staring into the dark liquid, as if searching for something he had lost. "I had a son," he finally said. "His name was William. He would be about Henry's age now." Grace felt her breath catch in her chest. She had suspected, of course, the way Elijah looked at Henry sometimes, with that mixture of pain and longing, the way he handled the boy with such unconscious tenderness, but hearing it confirmed was different. "What happened to him?" she asked softly. The silence stretched between them. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside. When Elijah spoke, his voice sounded like grinding stones. "He died, along with his mother, because I was not strong enough to protect them." He did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the coffee cup, on the dark reflection of his own face staring back at him. "Martha was my wife. We met at Fort Laramie after the war. I had just mustered out of the Union Army. I was a sharpshooter during the conflict. A good one, too good. I had blood on my hands that would never wash off, and I did not know how to live in the civilized world anymore." Grace listened without interruption. She sensed that these were words he had never spoken aloud before, words that had been locked away for 7 years, festering in the dark. "Martha looked at me, and she was not afraid. Everyone else was afraid of me. I was too big, too quiet, too strange. But Martha just looked at me and said I looked like I needed a decent meal." A ghost of a smile crossed his face and vanished. "We married 3 months later. I bought land in the Sweetwater Valley and we started building a life. It was hard work, brutal work. But we had each other, and that made it bearable." "And William?" "He was born 2 years after we married. Blonde hair like his mother. Blue eyes like—" Elijah stopped. He took a shaky breath. "He had this laugh, this giggle that could make you forget all the darkness in the world. He would follow me around the farm asking questions about everything. 'Why is the sky blue, Papa? Why do cows have 4 stomachs? Why does the wind blow?'" Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. "He was 4 years old when Hartwell came," Elijah continued. His voice had gone flat, emotionless, the only way he could get the words out. 4 years old when they threw us off our land. 4 years old when we started living in that wagon with no shelter and no hope. The fever took him." Elijah nodded slowly. Martha went first. The consumption had been eating at her for months, but being thrown out living in the cold and the rain, it accelerated everything. She died in my arms on a November night, looking up at the stars. Her last words were asking me to take care of William. He finally looked up, and Grace saw the full weight of his grief for the first time. It was staggering. It was ancient and bottomless, a wound that had never healed and never would. 2 days later, William got sick. The fever came on fast and hard. He kept calling for his mother. He did not understand why she would not come to him. Elijah's voice cracked. I held him all night. I told him stories. I sang him songs I did not even remember knowing. And when the sun came up, he was gone. Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her small, pale hand looked fragile against his massive, scarred fist. But she did not pull away, and neither did he. I am so sorry, she whispered. The words were inadequate, but they were all she had. I buried them side by side under a cottonwood tree, Elijah said, on the land that used to be ours, the land that Hartwell stole. Then I went looking for him. You wanted revenge. I wanted justice. But in the end I was a coward. I had him in my sights. My finger was on the trigger, and I could not do it. That does not make you a coward. It does. His voice was harsh, bitter. Because I did not spare him out of mercy or morality. I spared him because he laughed at me and told me that my family would be forgotten if I died. I spared him because I was afraid of being erased, because I was weak. Grace squeezed his hand tighter. You are not weak, she said firmly. You survived. You endured 7 years alone in this wilderness. You pulled me and my son out of the snow when you could have walked past and let us die. That is not weakness. Elijah looked at her. In the dim lamplight, her green eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. Henry needs a father, Grace continued. A real father. Someone who will teach him to be strong without being cruel. Someone who will protect him without trying to break him. Someone who knows that strength and gentleness can live in the same heart. She paused, gathering her courage. When this is over, when we are safe, I want Henry to have someone like that in his life. I want him to have someone like you. Elijah stared at her. For once the cold mask he wore had slipped. Beneath it she could see the man he had been before tragedy had reshaped him, a man who had loved and lost and was terrified to love again. You do not know me, he said quietly. You do not know what I have done, the things I did during the war, the blood on my hands. I know enough, Grace replied. I know what you are now, and that is all that matters. The fire crackled. The wind moaned. And in the small cabin on the mountain, 2 broken people took one small step toward something that might one day become healing. While the storm raged in the high country far below in the valley, a different kind of tempest was brewing. The town of Millbrook sat at the base of the mountains, a frontier settlement of perhaps 200 souls. It had a general store, a saloon, a church, and a courthouse. The courthouse was the largest building in town, 2 stories of brick and timber that loomed over the wooden structures around it like a king surveying his subjects. Inside the courthouse, in a private office on the 2nd floor, Judge Silas Hartwell was learning that his brother was dead. Silas was 52 years old, but he looked older. His hair had gone completely white, swept back from a high forehead lined with deep creases. His face was thin and hawk-like with a pointed nose and deep-set eyes the color of stagnant water. Those eyes held no warmth, no compassion, nothing but cold calculation and the absolute certainty of a man who believed himself above all others. He sat behind a massive oak desk surrounded by the trappings of power. Law books lined the walls. A United States flag hung in one corner. On the desk beside a crystal inkwell and a brass pen holder sat a framed photograph of his brother Victor. Standing before the desk, hat in hand, was Sheriff Jed Crawford. Crawford was the opposite of Hartwell in almost every way. Where the judge was thin and refined, Crawford was thick and brutal. His face was a map of scars, souvenirs from a lifetime of violence. He wore a Colt revolver on his right hip and a Bowie knife on his left. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had killed many times and would kill many more without losing a moment's sleep. "Say that again," Silas said quietly. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but Crawford had known the judge long enough to recognize the danger in that softness. "Victor is dead, Judge. Somebody beat his head in with the fireplace poker. The woman and the boy are gone." "The woman?" "Grace, your brother's wife." Silas leaned back in his chair. His thin fingers drummed against the armrest, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to count down toward something terrible. "Let me understand this correctly," Silas said. "My brother Victor Hartwell, a man whose family name commands respect throughout this territory, has been murdered by his wife, a woman we purchased from her father to settle a gambling debt." "That appears to be what happened, yes, sir. And this woman, instead of accepting her punishment like a civilized human being, has fled into the wilderness, in the worst storm in a decade, with a 5-year-old child." "Yes, sir." Silas was silent for a long moment. Then, without warning, his fist slammed down on the desk. The inkwell jumped. The penholder toppled over. The portrait of Victor rattled against the wood. "Do you have any idea what this means?" Silas roared, all pretense of calm vanishing. His face had gone red, veins standing out on his forehead. "A woman has killed a Hartwell. A woman has defied the law and escaped justice. If word of this spreads, every illiterate farmer and ignorant miner in the territory will think they can challenge my authority." Crawford did not flinch. He had weathered these storms before. "We have men searching, Judge, but the storm has blocked all the passes. We cannot get horses through. We cannot even get men through on foot without losing them to the cold. Then wait for the storm to pass and search again." By then she could be anywhere. Montana, Oregon. She could disappear and never be found. Silas stood abruptly, nearly knocking his chair over. He stalked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered streets of Millbrook, his town, his kingdom. "She will not disappear," he said, his voice dropping back to that dangerous softness. "A woman alone with a child in the wilderness. She has no supplies, no weapons, no skills. She will seek shelter. She will find help somewhere. The tracking reports before we lost visibility suggested she was heading toward the Wind River Range, the high country." Silas froze. Something flickered across his face. A memory. A name. "Wind River," he repeated slowly. "That is where Stone went, after I took his land." Crawford frowned. "Stone, sir. Elijah Stone. A troublesome rancher who thought he could defy me 7 years ago. I took everything from him, his land, his family, his pride. He threatened to kill me afterward, pointed a rifle at my head, and then lacked the courage to pull the trigger." "You think the woman found him?" "I do not know." Silas turned back to face Crawford. His eyes had gone cold and hard like chips of gray ice. "But if she did, if that woman is hiding in Stone's cabin, then we have an opportunity." "Sir, Stone should have died 7 years ago. I let him live because I thought watching him suffer was more satisfying than watching him hang. I was wrong. Loose ends have a way of tangling into nooses. If he is harboring a murderer, we can eliminate him without anyone questioning why." Crawford nodded slowly. "Two birds with one stone, so to speak." "Exactly." Silas walked to a cabinet in the corner of his office and removed a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured a measure into each and handed one to Crawford. "I want you to assemble a posse, not the usual deputies. I want hard men, men who will do what needs to be done without asking questions, men who are not squeamish about blood." "How many?" 15, no 20. Stone is dangerous. He was a sharpshooter in the war, one of the best. If we underestimate him, good men will die." Crawford raised an eyebrow. 20 men is expensive, Judge." "I do not care about the expense." Silas drained his whiskey in one swallow. "This is not about money. This is about power, about respect, about making sure that everyone in this territory understands that crossing Silas Hartwell means death." He set the empty glass down on his desk with a sharp click. "Find her, Crawford. Find her and bring her back to me alive. I want to hang her myself in the town square. I want everyone to watch her die slowly. And as for Stone—" Silas smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "If he gets in the way, burn his cabin to the ground with him in it. Burn the whole mountain if you have to, but do not come back without that woman." Crawford drained his own whiskey and set the glass beside the judge's. "Yes, sir. And the boy—" Silas waved a dismissive hand. "The boy is irrelevant. He has no Hartwell blood. If he gets in the way, dispose of him. If he does not, leave him for the wolves. I do not care either way." Crawford nodded once, placed his hat back on his head, and left the office without another word. Silas Hartwell stood alone in the gathering darkness, staring at his brother's photograph. "Do not worry, Victor," he said softly to the image. "I will make her pay. I will make them all pay." Outside, the storm continued to howl, but it was already beginning to weaken. Soon the skies would clear, soon the passes would open, and soon the hunt would begin. Back in the cabin, the sixth day dawned with an eerie silence. Elijah woke before the first gray light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows. For a moment he lay still, listening. Something was different. Something was wrong. Then he realized what it was. The wind had stopped. For nearly a week, the constant howl of the storm had been the backdrop of their existence. It had filled every silence, invaded every conversation, made the cabin walls seem thinner than they were. Now, suddenly, it was gone. Elijah rose quietly, careful not to wake Grace and Henry, and crossed to the window. He scraped away a layer of ice with his thumbnail and peered outside. The world had been transformed. Where before there had been chaos, now there was stillness. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, a pristine blanket of white that glittered in the pale pre-dawn light. The sky above was clear for the first time in days, a deep purple fading to pink at the eastern horizon. It was beautiful. It was deadly. With the storm gone, the passes would soon be traversable. The snow would settle and harden, creating a surface that men on snowshoes could cross. Their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. Elijah turned from the window and began to prepare. He moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, performing tasks he had hoped would never be necessary. He checked each of his weapons, cleaning and oiling them with practiced hands. The Sharps rifle, the Colt Navy revolver, the Bowie knife. He counted his ammunition, making mental calculations about how many men he could drop before running dry. Not enough. There would never be enough. He reinforced the door with additional wooden bars. He nailed heavy planks over the windows, leaving only narrow slits through which a rifle barrel could poke. He moved the heavy oak table in front of Henry's sleeping area, creating a makeshift barricade that would stop or at least slow a pistol round. Grace woke while he was working and watched him in silence for several minutes. She understood what he was doing. She understood what it meant. "How long do we have?" she finally asked. "Hard to say." Elijah did not stop his work. "The passes will be blocked for at least another day or two. Even after that, it will take time for a posse to be assembled and make the journey. We might have a week. We might have less. What do we do?" Elijah set down his hammer and turned to face her. In the dim light of the cabin, his scarred face looked like something carved from granite. "We prepare. We fight. We survive." Grace nodded slowly. Then she asked the question that had been haunting her since she first saw him reach for his weapons. "Can you teach me to shoot?" He stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he picked up the Colt Navy revolver and walked over to where she sat. "This is a Colt Navy," he said, holding the weapon so she could see it clearly. 6 shots. Heavy recoil. It will kick like a mule when you fire it, so you need to hold it with both hands. He demonstrated the grip, wrapping both hands around the handle with his elbows slightly bent. "Do not aim with your eye. Aim with your intent. Look at the center of the target, the center of the chest, if it is a man, and squeeze the trigger. Do not pull. Do not jerk. Squeeze." He handed her the weapon. It was heavier than she expected, cold and deadly in her hands. "If they get inside this cabin—" Elijah said, his voice deadly serious. "You do not hesitate. You point this at whoever is coming through the door, and you fire until it is empty, or they stop moving. Do you understand?" Grace looked down at the gun. She thought about Victor, about the feel of the fireplace poker in her hands, about the sound it made when it connected with his skull. "I understand," she said. "I have killed before. I can kill again if I have to." Elijah nodded. There was something in his eyes that might have been respect. "Then let us hope it does not come to that. But if it does, you will be ready." For the next several hours, Elijah taught Grace everything he could about the Colt: how to load it, how to clear a jam, how to judge distance and account for the weapon's tendency to pull to the left. They could not practice actual firing. The sound would carry too far and might alert anyone already searching for them. But Grace Dry fired hundreds of times until the motion became almost instinctive. Henry watched from his corner, clutching his wooden bear. He understood in the way that children understand such things that something bad was coming. But he also understood that the big man with the beard was going to protect them, that his mother was learning to be strong, that together they might survive. That evening, as the last light of day faded from the sky, Elijah and Grace stood at the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. The mountains were pink and gold in the sunset, achingly beautiful, despite the danger they now represented. "When the storm cleared," Grace said quietly, "I thought it meant we were safe, that the worst was over." "The storm was never the real danger," Elijah replied. "The storm was protection. It was the wall that kept them out. Now that wall is coming down." Grace was silent for a moment. Then she turned to face him. "Elijah, if they come, if something happens to me, promise me you will get Henry out. Promise me you will protect him no matter what." Elijah looked down at her. In the fading light, her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. "Promise me." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers intertwined with his, small and pale against his massive calloused grip. "I promise," he said, "but I am making you a different promise too. I promise that I will protect both of you. I promise that Hartwell and his men will not take you alive. And I promise that when this is over, we will walk out of these mountains together, all three of us." Grace looked up at him. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she did not have words for. Instead, she simply leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest. They stood like that for a long moment, two wounded souls drawing strength from each other. Behind them, Henry had fallen asleep on his cot, the wooden bear still clutched in his arms. Outside, the stars were appearing one by one in the clear winter sky. It was not love, not yet. But it was the beginning of something. The first tender shoots of trust and connection pushing up through the frozen soil of their grief. Tomorrow the hunt would begin, but tonight for just a few more hours they were safe. The seventh day dawned bright and clear and terrible. Elijah was awake before the sun, standing at the narrow slit he had left in the boarded window, scanning the tree line with his brass telescope. The snow sparkled in the early light so bright it hurt to look at. Nothing moved. No birds sang. The silence was absolute. Then around mid-morning he saw them, dark shapes moving between the trunks of the Douglas firs perhaps 600 yards out. They wore white to blend with the snow, but their movement betrayed them. No animal moved in such coordinated patterns. No deer or elk or bear traveled in a line. These were men. Elijah counted quickly. 10 that he could see. Probably more hiding in the trees waiting for the signal to advance. "Grace," he said, his voice calm and flat. "They are here." She was at his side in an instant, Henry's hand clutched in hers. Through the narrow slit she could see the distant figures for herself. "How many?" she asked. "At least 10, maybe more." Her face went pale, but her voice did not waver. "What do? We do what we planned. Henry, come here." The boy approached, his blue eyes wide with fear. Elijah knelt down so he could look the child in the eye. "Henry, I need you to be the bravest you have ever been. I need you to hide behind that table and not come out no matter what you hear, even if you hear yelling, even if you hear guns, Even if you hear me or your mama fall, you stay hidden. Do you understand?" Henry nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I understand." "Good boy." Elijah pressed the wooden bear into the child's hands. "I made this to protect you. It will keep you safe." He helped Henry crawl behind the overturned table, made sure the boy was completely hidden, and then returned to the window. A voice boomed from the tree line, projected with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the power. "Elijah Stone, this is Jed Crawford, Sheriff of Millbrook. I hold a warrant for the arrest of Grace Hartwell on charges of murder. Send her out and the boy, and we will let you go back to your miserable hermit life." Grace flinched at the words. Elijah placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Do not listen to him," he said quietly. "He is trying to break your nerve." "Come now, Stone," Crawford's voice continued. "She is just a murderous tramp who killed her husband in his sleep, smashed his head in while he was defenseless. Is that really the kind of woman you want to die for?" Grace's hands were shaking. The words cut deep, even though she knew they were lies. Victor had been far from defenseless. Victor had been about to murder her son. "He is a liar," Elijah said. "He was not there. He does not know what happened. He only knows what Hartwell told him to believe." He raised his voice to carry through the window. "She is under my protection. Crawford, step off my land, or I will bury you in it." A moment of silence. Then Crawford's voice came again, dripping with contempt. "Your land, this land belongs to the territory, Stone. You are nothing but a squatter with delusions of grandeur. Judge Hartwell sends his regards, by the way. He says you owe him 7 years of interest." Elijah did not respond. He was done talking. He raised the Sharps rifle and sighted through the narrow slit, not aiming at Crawford, not yet, but at the tree beside him. He wanted to send a message first. He exhaled slowly, letting his heartbeat settle into a slow, steady rhythm. His finger found the trigger. He squeezed. Boom! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. 600 yards away, bark exploded from the tree trunk just inches from Crawford's head. The sheriff dove into the snow, scrambling frantically for cover. "That was a warning!" Elijah roared. "The next one will not miss!" For a long moment, nothing happened. The echoes of the gunshot faded into silence. The white-clad figures in the trees had gone to ground, invisible against the snow. Then Crawford's voice rang out again, no longer confident. Now it was filled with rage. "Fine, Stone, we will do this the hard way." The forest erupted. It was not one gun. It was 10, 12, maybe more. Muzzle flashes sparkled from the tree line like fireflies in summer. Lead hammered into the cabin walls, punching through gaps in the logs, sending splinters flying through the air. The few remaining window panes shattered. A coffee pot on the stove pinged and spun as a bullet punched through it, spraying hot liquid across the room. "Down!" Elijah grabbed Grace and threw her to the floor as a slug tore through the chinking between the logs, exactly where her head had been a moment before. From behind the table, Henry screamed. "Stay down, Henry!" Grace shouted. "Do not move!" Elijah crawled to the window slit, raised the Sharps, and fired blindly into the smoke. He worked the lever, fired again. He could not see his targets, but the return fire from that direction slackened slightly. The noise was deafening, overwhelming. This was not combat as most people imagined it. This was chaos. Dust filled the air, choking them. Splinters of wood flew like shrapnel. The cabin shook with each impact. "They are pinning us down," Elijah shouted over the roar. "They do not care about hitting us. They just want to keep our heads down while they move closer." He was right. Under cover of the barrage, dark shapes were sprinting from tree to tree, closing the distance. They would be at the cabin walls within minutes. Elijah rose again, firing as fast as he could reload. He saw one of the shapes stumble and fall. Another dove behind a boulder just as his bullet cracked into the stone. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the shooting stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the noise. It meant they were done suppressing. It meant they were ready to advance. Then Elijah smelled it. Smoke. Not gunpowder smoke, wood smoke, coming from below. He dropped to his knees and pressed his palm against the floor. Hot, getting hotter. "They are under us," he said, the words coming out flat and hard. The crawl space. They threw a torch under the cabin. Grace's face went white. No, 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 no. Old pine logs, dry as bone after 7 years of mountain winters, saturated with flammable resin. The cabin was a tinderbox, and the fuse had just been lit. Flames began to lick up through the gaps in the floorboards. The air grew thick with acrid smoke. Behind the table, Henry started coughing. Elijah looked at Grace. In his eyes she saw the terrible calculation being made. "We cannot stay here," he said. "We burn to death or we go out the front and get shot. There has to be another way." Elijah's mind raced. The front door was a death trap. The windows were boarded. The back wall faced the ravine, a 20-foot drop to deep snow. He had boarded the back window too, but the boards were on the inside, nailed from within. "The back window," he said. "It faces the cliff. They will not expect us to jump. Jump from 20 feet. Into deep snow. It will hurt, but it will not kill us." He grabbed her shoulders. "It is our only chance. I go first to draw their fire. You throw Henry down to me, then you jump." "Elijah!" "There is no time to argue." Flames were spreading across the floor now, the heat becoming unbearable. "Get Henry ready." He grabbed his rifle and ran to the back of the cabin. With 2 powerful kicks he smashed through the wooden boards covering the window, then knocked out the remaining glass with his rifle butt. Cold air rushed in, feeding the fire behind them. The blaze roared higher, hungrier than before. Elijah looked back one last time. Grace was pulling Henry from behind the table, the boy coughing and crying. The cabin, his home for 7 years, was being consumed by flames. Everything he had built, everything he owned, gone. But he had something more important to save now. "When you hit the ground, run for the trees," he shouted. "The thick stand to the north, do not stop for anything." Then he threw himself through the window. The fall was a nightmare of rushing wind and white nothing. For 2 eternal seconds Elijah was weightless, suspended between the burning cabin and the frozen earth. Then impact. The snow absorbed most of the shock, but it still drove the breath from his lungs. He rolled, came up on one knee, rifle ready. Gunshots cracked from the side of the cabin. 2 men had come around the corner, spotted him falling. Elijah fired from the hip without aiming, and one of them went down. The other dove for cover. "Now!" Elijah screamed up at the burning window. "Throw him now!" Grace appeared in the window frame, silhouetted against the orange glow of the fire. She held Henry out the boy's legs, kicking in terror. "Catch him!" She let go. Henry fell. Elijah dropped his rifle and lunged, arms outstretched. The boy hit him like a sack of grain, driving him backward into the snow, but his arms wrapped around the child and held tight. "Run!" Elijah shoved the boy toward the tree line. "Run and do not look back." Henry ran, his small legs pumping through the deep snow. Elijah looked up just as Grace jumped. She hit the snowbank hard, tumbling, rolling. He grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet. "Go, go, go!" They ran. Behind them, the roof of the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks, a pillar of fire rising into the night sky like a beacon of destruction. The flames lit up the mountainside, turning night into terrible day. Bullets whipped past them. One tugged at Elijah's coat. Another sent up a spray of snow near Grace's feet. But they were moving, weaving between trees, putting distance and darkness between themselves and their pursuers. Henry had made it to the tree line. Elijah scooped him up without breaking stride, tucking the boy under his arm like a package. "Keep running," he gasped to Grace. "The ravine to the north. Do not stop." The shouts of men followed them, the crack of rifles. But the dense forest swallowed them, and slowly the sounds of pursuit faded. They had escaped, for now. But as Elijah looked back at the burning remnants of his home, he knew the fight was far from over. Crawford would regroup. Crawford would pursue. And somewhere behind him, Judge Silas Hartwell was waiting for his prize. The hunt was just beginning. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, haunting a frozen graveyard. The fire from the burning cabin cast a distant orange glow behind them, but ahead there was only blackness. The moon had not yet risen, and the stars provided barely enough light to distinguish tree from shadow, rock from void. Every step was a gamble, every breath a prayer. Elijah led the way. Henry clutched against his chest with one arm, his rifle in the other hand. His legs burned with exhaustion. His lungs screamed with each frigid breath. The wound on his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him during the escape throbbed with dull fire. But he did not slow down. He could not afford to slow down. Grace followed close behind, stumbling through the knee-deep snow in bare feet. She had lost her boots during the jump from the window, and now each step drove needles of ice into her flesh. The cold was eating at her, stealing her strength, but she forced herself forward, for Henry, for Elijah, for the desperate hope that somewhere ahead lay safety. Behind them, in the burning wreckage of the cabin, Crawford was surely rallying his men. The sheriff would not give up. He could not give up. Returning to Judge Hartwell without his prize would mean disgrace at best, death at worst. Crawford would pursue them to the ends of the earth if necessary. They had minutes, maybe less. How far? Grace gasped, her breath coming in ragged plumes of white vapor. The rocks, Elijah replied without turning. Devil's Anvil, 1/2 mile. We can hide there. 1/2 mile. It might as well have been half a continent. Grace could barely feel her feet anymore. Each step sent jolts of agony up her legs, but that agony was preferable to the alternative. If she stopped, she died. If she stopped, Henry died. So she kept moving. The forest closed around them, dense stands of pine and fir that blocked the distant firelight and plunged them into absolute darkness. Elijah navigated by instinct, by the memory of 7 years walking these mountains. He counted his steps. He felt for the subtle changes in terrain that told him where he was. Left at the fallen oak, right at the cluster of boulders, straight through the narrow gap between 2 massive pines. Henry had stopped crying. He was too exhausted, too cold, too shocked to produce tears. He simply clung to Elijah's neck with small frozen fingers and buried his face in the buffalo hide coat that still smelled of smoke and fear. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached Devil's Anvil. It was a chaotic jumble of massive granite boulders at the base of a sheer cliff thrown there millennia ago by some ancient geological violence. The rocks formed a labyrinth of narrow passages and hidden chambers perfect for defense, but nearly impossible to navigate in darkness. Elijah found the opening he was looking for, a narrow fissure between 2 massive stones that led to a small cave barely large enough for 3 people. He ducked through the gap and set Henry down gently. "In here," he whispered to Grace, "all the way to the back. Cover the boy's mouth if he tries to speak. Do not make a sound until I come for you." Grace crawled past him into the darkness, pulling Henry with her. The cave smelled of damp stone and old leaves, but it was shelter. It was safety, at least for the moment. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I am going to buy us time." Elijah checked the load in his rifle. 5 rounds left in the sharps, 3 in the Colt. Not enough. Never enough. "If I do not come back by dawn, wait for daylight, then head south toward the mining camp. Do not look back." "Elijah!" He reached out in the darkness and found her hand. He squeezed it once hard. "I will come back," he said. "I promise." Then he was gone, melting into the shadows like a wraith. Grace pulled Henry close, wrapping her arms around him, sharing what little body heat remained between them. The boy was shivering violently, his teeth chattering in a rhythm that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. "Mama," he whispered. "Shh, baby. We have to be quiet, like mice hiding from the cat." "Is Mr. Elijah going to fight the bad men?" Grace closed her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. He is going to protect us." "Is he going to win?" She did not answer. She could not answer. Instead, she held her son tighter and prayed to whatever God might be listening in this frozen wilderness. Outside in the labyrinth of stone, Elijah was hunting. He circled back toward the direction they had come, moving silently through the snow, despite his size. 7 years of stalking prey in these mountains had taught him how to move without leaving traces, how to use the shadows and the terrain to his advantage. He found a ridge overlooking the trail and settled into position. From here he could see the path that any pursuers would have to take. He raised the sharps and waited. 10 minutes passed. 15. The cold seeped into his bones, but he remained motionless. A hunter learned patience or he starved. Then he saw them. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, following the trail of footprints that led toward Devil's Anvil. They moved cautiously, guns raised, scanning the trees for any sign of ambush. Crawford was in the lead, his white winter gear stained dark with soot and blood. 2 deputies flanked him, younger men with hard eyes and quick hands. Elijah let them get closer. 50 yards, 40, 30. Then he fired. The sharps roared spitting flame into the darkness. The deputy on the left spun and dropped a hole punched through his chest before he even heard the shot. Chaos erupted. Crawford and the surviving deputy dove for cover, scrambling behind rocks and trees. Gunfire cracked out wild and unfocused bullets, whining off the stones around Elijah's position. But he was already moving. He had learned long ago that a sniper who stayed in one place was a dead sniper. He ghosted through the rocks flanking left, putting a massive boulder between himself and the return fire. The surviving deputy was panicking, firing blindly into the darkness, wasting ammunition on shadows. Elijah circled around behind him, moving with the patience of a wolf closing on a wounded deer. He did not use the rifle this time. Ammunition was too precious. Instead, he drew his Bowie knife. The deputy never saw him coming. One moment he was crouched behind a fallen log, cursing and reloading his pistol. The next, a massive hand clamped over his mouth and something cold and sharp slid across his throat. Elijah lowered the body to the snow without a sound. 2 down. Crawford remained. The sheriff had found better cover wedged into a gap between 2 boulders that protected him from multiple angles. He was no fool. He knew he was outmatched in the darkness, and he was not going to make himself an easy target. "Stone!" Crawford shouted, his voice echoing off the rocks. "You cannot win this. There are more men coming, a dozen more. Kill me, and they will hunt you down like a dog." Elijah did not answer. He was moving again, trying to find an angle on Crawford's position. "The judge wants the woman alive, but he does not care about you. Surrender, and I will let you walk away. You have my word." The word of a man who served Silas Hartwell was worth less than nothing. Elijah kept moving. He found a narrow gap between 2 rocks that gave him a partial view of Crawford's hiding spot. The sheriff's hat was visible, just barely poking above the stone. Not enough for a kill shot, but maybe enough to flush him out. Elijah raised the sharps, aimed, and fired. The bullet sparked off the rock inches from Crawford's head. The sheriff yelped and dove out of cover, rolling across the snow, coming up with his pistol blazing. One of the bullets caught Elijah in the shoulder. The impact spun him around, sent him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through his arm, hot and blinding. The sharps fell from his grip and disappeared into a snowdrift. Crawford was on his feet now, advancing, a vicious grin splitting his scarred face. "Got you!" the sheriff snarled. He levered a fresh round into his Winchester and aimed at Elijah's chest. "Silas was right about you. You are good, but not good enough." Elijah reached for his Colt with his wounded arm. His fingers found the grip, but his hand was shaking too badly to aim. Blood was flowing down his arm, staining the snow beneath him red. "Any last words, Stone? Any message you want me to deliver to that whore before I drag her back to hang?" Elijah looked up at the man standing over him. He had faced death before. In the war in the mountains, in 100 moments when survival seemed impossible. He had always found a way to keep fighting, but this time the fight was over. His arm would not obey him. The gun felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Crawford was right there, rifle aimed, finger on the trigger. This was the end. Then a voice split the night. "No!" The scream came from the rocks behind Crawford. A figure burst into the open, running through the snow, something gleaming in her hands. Grace. She had left the cave. She had left Henry. She had emerged from hiding with the Colt Navy revolver clutched in both hands, arms extended exactly as Elijah had taught her. Crawford spun around, surprised, his rifle swinging toward this new threat. But Grace was not looking at his face. She was not looking at his gun. She was looking at the center of his chest, just as Elijah had instructed. She squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked in her hands, the recoil throwing her arms up, but her aim was true. The bullet caught Crawford square in the sternum, exactly where she had aimed. The sheriff staggered backward, a look of profound disbelief crossing his scarred features. He looked down at the dark bloom spreading across his white coat. He looked up at Grace, this woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a murderous tramp. He tried to speak. Blood bubbled from his lips instead of words. Then he collapsed backward into the snow, his eyes staring sightlessly at the cold stars above. Silence fell over the rocks. The echo of the gunshot faded into nothing. Grace stood frozen, the smoking revolver still raised, her entire body shaking. She had killed a man. Again. This time in cold blood, with deliberate aim, with full knowledge of what she was doing. And she did not regret it for an instant. The gun fell from her hands. She ran to Elijah, sliding to her knees beside him in the blood-stained snow. "Elijah! Oh God, Elijah!" "I am all right," he grunted, though the pain in his voice said otherwise. "Through and through, missed the bone. You are bleeding everywhere." "It looks worse than it is." He struggled to sit up, wincing. "Where is Henry?" "Still in the cave. I told him to stay hidden." Elijah looked at her. In the starlight he could see tears streaming down her face, but he could also see something else, something fierce and unbroken. "You saved my life," he said. "You saved mine first." She pressed her hands against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "I was not going to let him take that from us. I was not going to let him win." Elijah reached up with his good hand and touched her face. His fingers left a smear of blood across her cheek, but neither of them noticed. "We saved each other," he said softly. Grace laughed through her tears, a broken, exhausted sound that was somehow the most beautiful thing Elijah had ever heard. "We saved each other," she repeated. Behind them, Henry emerged from the rocks. He ran to them and threw his arms around both of them, his small body pressed between theirs. "Mama, Mr. Elijah, I was so scared." "I know, baby, I know. But we are all right now. We are all going to be all right." Elijah wrapped his good arm around both of them, holding them close. The pain in his shoulder was fading to a dull throb. The cold was seeping into his bones. But in this moment, surrounded by this woman and this child, he felt something he had not felt in 7 years. He felt whole. But they were not safe yet. Elijah forced himself to his feet, biting back a groan of pain. He retrieved his fallen rifle from the snowdrift and checked it over, still functional though caked with ice. He would need to clean it before it could be reliably fired again. "Crawford said there were more coming," he said, scanning the trees. "We cannot stay here." "Can you walk?" "I can walk. I can run if I have to." He looked down at Grace's bare feet, now wrapped in bloody rags. "The question is whether you can." "I can do whatever I have to do," Grace said firmly. "Where do we go?" Elijah was silent for a moment, considering their options. South led to the mining camp, but that was also the direction Crawford's reinforcements would come from. East and west were blocked by impassable terrain. North led deeper into the mountains, into territory so wild and remote that even Elijah had rarely ventured there. But he knew of one place, one sanctuary that he had discovered years ago and never told another soul about. "There is a valley," he said slowly. 2 days north through the high passes. It is hidden between the peaks, protected from the wind. I found it my first year up here, but I never—" He paused. "I never had a reason to go back." "Why not?" "Because I was alone, and it seemed like a place that should have a family in it." Grace looked at him. Even in the darkness he could see the understanding in her eyes. "Then let us give it one," she said. They moved out before dawn, heading north into the unknown. The first day was brutal. The terrain rose steadily, the snow growing deeper with each mile. Elijah broke trail as best he could, using his body to forge a path through drifts that sometimes reached his waist. Grace followed in his footsteps, carrying Henry when the boy grew too tired to walk on his own. The wound in Elijah's shoulder bled sluggishly despite the bandage Grace had fashioned from strips of his shirt. They stopped only when absolutely necessary, and never for long. Every moment they rested was a moment for their pursuers to catch up. Crawford was dead, but the men he had brought would not simply give up. They had seen the bodies. They knew which direction the fugitives had fled. Sooner or later, they would come. By nightfall, they had covered perhaps 5 miles. Not nearly enough, but more than seemed possible given their condition. They found shelter in a shallow cave, really just an overhang of rock that provided minimal protection from the wind. There was no fire. A fire would be a beacon visible for miles. Instead, they huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat as the temperature plummeted. Henry fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted beyond the ability to remain conscious. Grace held him close, her body curled around his. "How is the shoulder?" she asked quietly, her breath warm against Elijah's neck. "It will hold," he replied. "I have had worse." "That does not make me feel better." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "It was not meant to make you feel better. It was meant to make you stop worrying. I am going to worry whether you like it or not." They lay in silence for a while, listening to the wind and the distant howl of wolves. Despite everything, despite the pain and the cold and the danger, there was something almost peaceful about this moment. "Tell me about the valley," Grace said finally. "What is it like?" Elijah closed his eyes, remembering. He had not thought about that place in years, had not allowed himself to think about it because thinking about it meant thinking about the future, and for so long he had believed he had no future. "It is beautiful," he said, "protected on all sides by mountains so the wind cannot reach it. There is a stream that runs through the center, fed by hot springs, so it never completely freezes. The grass grows thick in summer. Deer and elk come to drink. Eagles nest on the cliffs above. It sounds like paradise." "It could be, with the right people." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and found his hand in the darkness. "I never thought I would have a future," she said softly. "With Victor, every day was just about surviving until the next one. I never allowed myself to imagine anything beyond that. It was too painful. And now, she squeezed his hand. "Now I am starting to think maybe there is something worth imagining." Elijah squeezed back. In the darkness he allowed himself to hope. For the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to believe that the pain of the past did not have to define the rest of his life. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be harder." The second day was as promised harder. The passes grew steeper. The snow grew deeper. Elijah's wound began to throb with renewed intensity as the cold seeped into it. Grace's feet, despite the crude wrappings, were showing signs of frostbite. Henry had developed a cough that worried both adults, but they kept moving. They had no choice. Around midday, Elijah spotted movement on a ridge behind them. Distant figures barely visible against the white landscape, but unmistakably human. "They found our trail," he said grimly. Grace looked back. Her face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "How far behind?" "A few hours, maybe less if they push hard." "Can we outrun them?" Elijah considered the question. Normally, yes. He knew these mountains better than any man alive. But normally, he was not wounded and escorting a woman with damaged feet and a 5-year-old child. "We have to try," he said. "The valley is not far now. If we can reach it before they reach us." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Grace understood. Reaching the valley meant safety. Getting caught before they reached it meant death. They pushed on with renewed urgency. Elijah drove himself harder than he had ever driven himself before, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, the burning in his legs, the voice in his head that whispered, it would be so easy to just stop to rest, to let the cold take him. Grace matched him step for step, her jaw set in determination. She had not come this far to fail now. She had not killed 2 men and fled through a frozen wilderness to die within sight of safety. She would reach that valley or she would die trying. Henry rode on Elijah's shoulders, now too weak to walk. The boy was burning with fever, his small body fighting off the sickness that came from exposure and exhaustion. He needed warmth. He needed rest. He needed medicine that none of them had. He needed them to succeed. Late in the afternoon they reached the entrance to the valley. It was exactly as Elijah remembered. A narrow gap between two towering cliffs, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The rocks on either side had been carved by ancient glaciers into smooth walls that rose hundreds of feet into the air. A man could walk within 10 feet of the entrance and never see it. Elijah stopped at the threshold. Behind them the distant figures had grown closer. He could make out individual shapes now. 5 men, maybe 6. Too many to fight in his condition. "Through here," he said. "Quickly." They slipped through the gap, the rock walls closing around them like the jaws of some great stone beast. The passage twisted and turned, narrowing at points until Elijah had to turn sideways to fit through. For 50 yards they walked in near total darkness, the walls pressing in from both sides. Then the passage opened up, and Grace gasped. The valley spread out before them like something from a dream. It was perhaps a mile wide and 3 miles long, nestled between towering peaks that shielded it from the worst of the winter winds. Snow covered the ground, but not as deeply as outside. Here and there patches of green grass poked through, fed by the warmth of the hot springs that Elijah had mentioned. A stream wound through the center, wisps of steam rising from its surface. In the distance, a herd of elk grazed peacefully, unafraid of the newcomers. "Oh," Grace breathed. "Oh, Elijah. I told you it was beautiful." Beautiful does not begin to describe it. They made their way down into the valley proper, following the stream until they reached a small grove of pine trees that provided natural shelter. There finally, Elijah allowed himself to stop. He built a fire. For the first time in days, they had true warmth. Grace stripped the wet rags from her feet and held them toward the flames, wincing as sensation returned. Henry, still feverish, was wrapped in Elijah's buffalo coat and laid close to the blaze. "Will they follow us?" Grace asked, watching the narrow gap they had come through. "Eventually they will find the entrance, but that passage is a death trap for anyone who does not know it. I can hold that gap against a dozen men with this rifle." He was already checking the sharps, cleaning the ice from its mechanism, preparing for the possibility of another fight. "And if they do not come—" Elijah looked at her. The firelight danced across his scarred face, softening his features. "Then we build something here. A cabin, a home, a life, a family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "If you want one," Elijah said carefully. "With me." Grace smiled. It was the first real smile he had seen from her since before the cabin burned. It transformed her face, made her look young and beautiful and full of hope. "Yes," she said simply. "I want that." Henry stirred in his blankets. "Mama, are we safe now?" Grace looked at her son, then at the man who had saved them both, then at the valley that would become their new home. "Yes, baby," she said. "We are safe. We are finally safe." The pursuers never came. Perhaps they found the entrance and decided the narrow passage was too dangerous to navigate. Perhaps they gave up and returned to Millbrook to report their failure to Judge Hartwell. Perhaps they simply got lost in the mountains and perished in the cold. Elijah never found out, and he never cared enough to investigate. The important thing was that they were gone, and the valley remained undiscovered. The first weeks were hard. They had no shelter beyond the pine grove, no supplies beyond what they could hunt and forage. Elijah's wound healed slowly, hampering his ability to work. Henry's fever broke after 3 days of anxious watching, but the boy remained weak for weeks afterward. But they survived. More than that, they began to build. Elijah felled trees and shaped them into logs. Grace mixed mud and straw to fill the gaps between them. Henry carried stones for the fireplace, his small hands eager to contribute. By the time the worst of winter passed, a cabin stood where there had been only wilderness before. It was small and crude, nothing like the homes in the valley below, but it was theirs. Spring arrived like a miracle. The snow melted, revealing meadows of wildflowers that painted the valley in shades of purple and yellow and white. The stream swelled with meltwater, its banks lined with tender green grass. The elk gave birth to spotted calves that wobbled on unsteady legs. Birds returned from wherever birds go in winter, filling the air with song. Henry recovered fully, growing strong on fresh game and clean mountain air. He ran through the meadows with the energy of a child who has never known fear, chasing butterflies and splashing in the stream and asking endless questions about everything he saw. Elijah taught him to fish, to track deer, to read the weather from the shape of the clouds, to respect the wilderness that surrounded them without fearing it. Grace learned to shoot properly, to skin and tan hides, to make soap and candles from animal fat, to plant a garden in the rich soil near the hot springs where vegetables could grow almost year-round. But it was not all work. There was laughter, too. There were quiet evenings by the fire with Grace reading aloud from the single book they possessed, while Elijah whittled and Henry played with his wooden animals. There were games of chase in the meadow. There were songs sung badly but with great enthusiasm. There was slowly but surely love. It was not the passionate, all-consuming love of youth. It was something deeper and more durable. It was two wounded souls finding solace in each other. Two people who had lost everything, discovering that loss did not have to be the end of their story. One evening in late spring, as the sun set behind the western peaks and the sky turned shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible, Elijah took Grace's hand and led her to a spot overlooking the valley. "This is where I want to build the real cabin," he said, "bigger than the one we have now, with a proper bedroom for us and a room for Henry and maybe—" He paused suddenly, uncertain. "Maybe a room for more someday." Grace looked out at the valley, then back at the man beside her, the man who had saved her from the snow, who had fought for her, who had been willing to die for her and her son. "More sounds good," she said. "More sounds very good." She leaned into him, and his arm wrapped around her, and together they watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. It was not a wedding in the traditional sense. There was no priest, no church, no witnesses beyond Henry and the elk in the meadow. But standing there on that overlook, holding each other as the first stars appeared, they made promises to each other that were more sacred than any ceremony could provide. "I will protect you," Elijah said, "for as long as I live." "And I will stand beside you," Grace replied, "through whatever comes." It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 3 months after they arrived in the valley, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for weeks but had not dared to say anything, afraid that speaking it aloud might somehow jinx it. But when the signs became undeniable, she knew she had to tell Elijah. She chose a quiet afternoon when Henry was napping and the summer sun was warm on their skin. Elijah was working on the new cabin fitting logs together with the precision of a man who took pride in his craftsmanship. "Elijah," she said, "I need to tell you something." He set down his tools and turned to face her, concern flickering across his features. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." She smiled, and the smile was radiant. "Something is very, very right." She took his hand and placed it on her belly. For a moment he did not understand. Then understanding dawned, and his eyes went wide. "You mean—" "Yes, come winter Henry will have a brother or sister." Elijah stared at her. His mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. Then he did something Grace had never seen him do before. He laughed. A full, joyous laugh that rang across the valley and echoed off the mountains and seemed to shake the very sky. He picked her up and spun her around, mindful of her condition but unable to contain his happiness. He kissed her long and deep, and when they finally broke apart, there were tears streaming down his scarred cheeks. "A child," he whispered. "Our child. Our child." He set her down gently and knelt before her, pressing his ear against her belly as if he could somehow hear the life growing inside. "Hello in there," he said softly. "I am your father, and I promise you that you will never know fear. You will never know hunger. You will never know the cruelty of the world outside this valley. I will protect you with everything I have, just as I protect your mother and your brother." Grace ran her fingers through his hair, this giant of a man kneeling before her like a supplicant at an altar. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. "I have had practice," he replied, glancing toward the cabin where Henry slept. "That boy has taught me more about being a father than I ever knew I had to learn." He stood and pulled her close, holding her against his chest. 7 years ago, he said, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything that mattered. I came to these mountains to die slowly because I was too much of a coward to die quickly. And now I understand that I was not dying. I was waiting for you, waiting for Henry, waiting for the family I thought I would never have again." Grace looked up at him, her green eyes bright with tears. "We found each other in a storm," she said, "and together we walked out of it. Together," Elijah agreed, "always together." In the distance, Henry emerged from the cabin, rubbing sleep from his eyes. When he saw his mother and Elijah embracing, he ran toward them, his face split by a huge grin. "What is happening? Why is everyone hugging?" Grace knelt down and took her son's hands. "Henry, how would you feel about having a baby brother or sister?" The boy's eyes went wide. "Really? A real baby? A real baby? Coming this winter?" Henry whooped with joy and threw his arms around both of them, his small body somehow managing to embrace 2 adults at once. "I am going to be a big brother. I am going to teach the baby everything, how to fish, and how to carve, and how to track deer, and everything." "You are going to be a wonderful big brother," Elijah said, ruffling the boy's hair. They stood there in the afternoon sun, the 3 of them soon to be 4, surrounded by the mountains that had become their sanctuary. The valley stretched out around them, green and gold and impossibly beautiful. Somewhere beyond those peaks, Judge Silas Hartwell was still alive, still ruling his corrupt little kingdom, still perhaps wondering what had become of the woman who had killed his brother and the man who had defied him twice. But here in this hidden paradise his power meant nothing. His laws did not reach. His cruelty could not touch them. Here there was only love and hope and the promise of tomorrow. The legend of the Wind River Range would grow over the years. Trappers who ventured into the high country would sometimes speak of a hidden valley where a family lived, a giant of a man and a green-eyed woman, and children who ran through the meadows like wild things. They would say that the man had once been a soldier, and the woman had once been a prisoner, and together they had found something that most people spend their whole lives searching for. They would say that love, true love, was the only fire that winter could not kill, and they would be right. Somewhere in that valley, as the sun set over the western peaks and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, a family gathered around a fire in a cabin built with their own hands. A man told stories of the war and the wilderness. A woman laughed at his jokes and corrected his exaggerations. A boy of perhaps 8 listened with wide eyes hanging on every word. A girl of 3 sat on her father's lap, clutching a wooden bear that had been carved with love many years before. And in the cradle by the hearth, a baby slept dreaming whatever dreams babies dream, safe and warm, and utterly unaware of the darkness that had once threatened to consume them all. This was the family that the storm had made. This was the love that had burned hot enough to melt the snow. This was home.